Now, let me introduce Angelina Diliberto Allen. She's from a Baha'i family that goes quite far back, really to the time of Abdu'l-Bahá coming to California in 1912. Her family pioneered to Argentina when she was a young girl, and they were teaching the Araucan peoples in southern Argentina and Patagonia. Later, she herself was in El Salvador, and then later, as an adult, she and her husband, Andrew, continued to serve the Baha'i faith in Africa in various places. She completed an undergraduate degree in English and a graduate degree in writing and rhetoric, the latter from UC San Diego. She's now recently retired from teaching at high school, and writing the biography of John David Bosch has been a long-held wish for her, and I can tell my conversations with her that has been a passion as well. So I am delighted to introduce you, Angelina. Thank you so much for joining us today in this web talk. And I'll now turn the program over to you so you can start sharing your slideshow and get started. I'll stop sharing mine right now.
Hello, everyone. I know that you're here because you have an attraction to Bosch Baha'i School and to John Bosch himself. And I think really this book conveys the feelings that we all share. And so I want to say that it's important that we remember that when we write books through the Baha'i Publishing Trust of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, that really we're doing it as a path of service, and that the Publishing Trust's goal is to publish books that disseminate the Word of God. I also wanted to acknowledge Brent Poirier, who assisted in the review of this book, and Martha Schweitz, whose careful review and wonderful advice made the book what it is. I think that it's important for us to think about why the book is titled the way it is. There's a quotation from The Guardian that says, "There are two kinds of Baha'is, one might say, those whose religion is Baha'i and those who live for the faith. Needless to say, if we can belong to the latter category, if we can be in the vanguard of heroes, martyrs, and saints, it is more praiseworthy in the sight of God." And so for that reason, I titled the book that way, because as we'll learn in reading this book, that John Bosch certainly lived a life in the vanguard of heroes, martyrs, and saints. I wanted to acknowledge Molly King, who I know many of you might be smiling at this picture right now. I've dedicated the book to her and to Jim Kelly, who was the administrator at Bosch. And the way I think about Molly King, she was the program director at Bosch Baha'i School. And to me, she was the person who every boy and girl wanted to grow up to be like. I also wish to acknowledge Marcia Gale, whose early biography of John Bosch, it was about a 30-page manuscript, was sent by her to the National Spiritual Assembly of Switzerland. And I wrote to the National Spiritual Assembly of Switzerland for Marcia Gale's manuscript. And the beginnings of the book is based on Marcia Gale's manuscript. We know that she's the daughter of Ali Kuli Khan and Florence Breed, and she helped translate many works for the faith, and as a girl knew Abdu'l-Bahá, pictured here with her brothers. I think it's also important to remember, especially those of us who are new in our learning about the Baha'i faith, that Abdu'l-Bahá was not a prophet or a messenger of God. He is the son of the messenger of God. And much of the story of John Bosch revolves around stories about Abdu'l-Bahá. And so we think about Abdu'l-Bahá as the perfect exemplar of Baha'i teachings. And in many ways, he was compared to being like the moon. And we know that the moon is a dead rock. It has no inherent light of its own. It gets all of its light from reflecting from the sun. And in that way, Abdu'l-Bahá is the perfect reflection of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. So we focus so much on his life because he is that example for us. I think it's also important to remember that Pilgrim's Notes are not authoritative, but they are vastly intriguing to us. And we are permitted to read them as long as we remember that they are not authoritative. In fact, most importantly, we should remember that to deepen in the cause means to read the writings of Baha'u'llah and the Master so thoroughly as to be able to give it to others in its pure form. I think central to the story of John Bosch is the message from the Rizwan message of 2018 from the Universal House of Justice, where the Universal House of Justice said that there will be a gathering in November of 2021 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá. And that gathering will gather together representatives of national spiritual assemblies and regional Baha'i councils. And we know the elected members of institutions are called the rulers. And so there will be a gathering of rulers in November of 2021 to commemorate the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá. And that gathering will take place in the Holy Land. And then in January of 2022, there will be a gathering of the learned, those appointed members of institutions of the cause, who will commemorate the 100th anniversary of the public reading of the Master's will. And John Bosch was present at both of those events in 1921 and in January of 1922. And so it's of great interest to us to read from John Bosch's own words about these events that we'll be commemorating in a year. So who was John Bosch? And this picture was his passport photo taken just before he traveled to the Holy Land in 1921. And it's wonderful to think of, this is what he looked like when he was in the Holy Land and there at the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. John Bosch was from Switzerland, from St. Gallen. And Shoghi Effendi said that no doubt when the cause spreads more throughout Switzerland, this fatherland of his will grow to be proud of this heroic and noble soul it produced, even though the best days of his life were spent in America. And so this story begins on a train, and I'm going to mute the video of my face because these slides involve many photographs of Abdu'l-Bahá, and eventually the slides will lead us to photographs involving the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. And it seemed to me more respectful just to have those pictures alone. John Bosch was 48 years old in 1903, and he had just come recently from Switzerland to become a superintendent of a winery in Sonoma County, California. And he was on a train when, let's see, my video is not, oh, there we go. And he met a woman on the train who had a book that he wanted to know about. And in his memoir, he writes, in 1903, October, on the train from San Francisco to Cloverdale, a Mrs. Beckwith had a book with her called Abbas Effendi. After reading a few pages, I asked her where I could obtain one, as I felt strongly that I should read the whole book. It was the early edition of Abbas Effendi by Phelps, and Mrs. Beckwith said that if you go and call on Mrs. Goodall in Oakland, and that I could buy a book from her. Mrs. Beckwith said to me before going into this that to hear of this is the greatest privilege, but it will be followed up by the greatest obligations, and better not know it if you cannot follow it. So I called on Mrs. Helen Goodall early in 1904 on Jackson Street in Oakland, and she gave me the first inspiring words and explanations of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Bahá. And so it's important for us to think about who Helen Goodall was, since she had such a great influence on John Bosch. She was named by The Guardian as a disciple of Abdu'l-Bahá, and the others are pictured here, but those of note are, of course, Hand of the Cause of God, John Esselmont, who Abdu'l-Bahá said, "Blessed is he that the word of God reached him and found his soul awake." And the Guardian said, Esselmont's book titled Baha'u'llah and the New Era will inspire generations yet unborn to tread the path of true service and steadfastly and unostentatiously as was trodden by its author. Another disciple of Abdu'l-Bahá was Robert Turner, the first American Baha'i of African descent. And he was one of the first Western pilgrims to meet Abdu'l-Bahá in Haifa in 1898. Abdu'l-Bahá promised him that if he remained firm and steadfast until the end, he would be a door through which a whole race would enter the kingdom. Another disciple of Abdu'l-Bahá, of course, was Lua Getzinger. And Abdu'l-Bahá said, O Lord, grant her a palace in the neighborhood of thy most great mercy. And in a cable to America, Shoghi Effendi said of her, immortal Lua, mother teacher of the American Baha'i community. And it is in this company then that Helen Goodall is named a disciple of Abdu'l-Bahá. Abdu'l-Bahá relied greatly on her in the teaching work in California. He said, Mrs. Goodall's value is not known now. It will be known in the future. She has no other thought than to serve the cause. God has certain treasuries hidden in the world, which he reveals when the time comes. She is like one of these treasuries. In her letters to John Bosch, Helen Goodall was unambiguous and practical. In fact, in one of the letters, because they corresponded between Oakland and Geyserville, where John lived, and in one of those letters, she said to John that the master says that there is nothing that man cannot find out. And I think this must have really attracted John Bosch as a religion that encouraged the independent investigation of truth. After all, it's Baha'u'llah who says that the faith of no man can be conditioned by anyone except himself. And so it was in that spirit then that John Bosch decided to write to Abdu'l-Bahá and said, to the greatest branch, I believe in the existence of an almighty power of which we are all created and descendants. By degree and choices we had manifestations, and I sincerely believe that thou art one of this higher exalted manifestation of the universal power. Thy teachings are proof of the continuance of the spiritual evolution, and may my name be entered in the great book of this universal life is my earnest request. My watchword will be justice. Humbly, thy servant, John D. Bosch. And so now that he had become a Baha'i, he was entering this true brotherhood. In fact, it was the Bab who wrote, become as true brethren in the one and indivisible religion of God, so that ye may find yourselves reflected in them and they in you. And so in 1909, John Bosch went to the first Temple Unity Convention, which we know was the first gathering established to establish the National Bahá'í community as a permanent institution. And at that same time, that very day that these delegates gathered in Wilmette, Abdu'l-Bahá was at that same time interring the holy remains of the Bab on Mount Carmel. And in fact, Abdu'l-Bahá wrote to this convention and said that the holy nature of this gathering was that it took place simultaneously at the same time as the interment of the remains of the Bab on Mount Carmel. Present at that convention, of course, was John Bosch, Thornton Chase, Charles Greenleaf, Edward Getzinger, Mountfort Mills, Howard McNett, Susan Moody, even Mason Reamy, and of course, Corinne True, and others. And it was at this convention that John Bosch established his true sense of brotherhood with Thornton Chase, the first American Baha'i. We know that their friendship was endearing, and it's so wonderful to read about their relationship. They corresponded from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and they would sometimes meet in San Francisco and walk each other to each other's hotel room back and forth, rather to their different hotels, so that they could spend more time talking together. But I think most important in the correspondence between John and Thornton Chase is a letter that Thornton Chase received from Abdu'l-Bahá that was addressed to John Bosch. And Thornton Chase writes, "My dear friend," to John, "I am happy to enclose to you herewith a tablet in translation from Abdu'l-Bahá. I congratulate you on getting this tablet, even though it emphasizes the fact that spirituous liquors will not be used in the new kingdom on earth. Of course, the change will come gradually, as all great changes do." And here is the tablet from Abdu'l-Bahá to John Bosch. "O thou who art attracted to the kingdom of God. Regarding the use of liquors, according to the text of the book of Actas, both light and strong drinks are prohibited. The reason for this prohibition is that it leads the mind astray and is the cause of weakening the body. In brief, I hope that thou mayest become exhilarated with the wine of the love of God, that thou mayest find eternal bliss and receive inexhaustible joy and happiness. The after effect of drinking is depression, but the wine of the love of God becomes exaltation of the spirit." And so Abdu'l-Bahá wrote John Bosch wrote to Abdu'l-Bahá's secretary in Washington and said, "My dear spiritual brother, I'm enclosing here with a letter to our master Abdu'l-Bahá, which letter I wish you kindly send to him. Stamp and envelope enclosed herewith. Following the instruction of Abdu'l-Bahá, I feel inclined to gradually change my occupation and business. For this reason, I wish to find out if any new production plants, such as vines, grains, figs, nuts, could be introduced here from Syria or Persia for good commercial results and going hand in hand with Baha'ism. We have good climate here in California, and possibly plants from the East would mature well here." And of course, we know that John Bosch did change his profession and began producing grape juice that was non-alcoholic, and eventually retired from his superintendency in the wine industry and devoted his entire life to service to the cause. Another thing that we know about John Bosch and Thornton Chase is that it was their conversation together that where they were trying to figure out ways to get Abdu'l-Bahá to come to California and include California in his itinerary in his trip to America. Abdu'l-Bahá had no plans to come to California, but he said that if the friends in California demonstrated firmness in the covenant, then he would come to California. And Thornton Chase said to John, "I'm not sure that the Baha'is in California are ready for Abdu'l-Bahá." And John Bosch said, "Well, I'm ready." And so he wrote to Abdu'l-Bahá and said that the friends in California are firm in the covenant. They also, John and Thornton Chase shared an interest in two books that were available to Baha'is at that time. One was The Oriental Rose by Mary Hanford Ford, and the other one, God's Heroes by Laura Clifford Barney, both of them about Tahirih. And so it's wonderful to know that John and Thornton Chase's primary reading interest was reading about the story of Tahirih. Of other note, of course, is the life of Thornton Chase, which Robert Stockman's book about him is really so wonderful and probably important for every American Baha'i to read. And John Bosch was Thornton Chase's literary executor, and John Bosch kept all of the surviving papers of Thornton Chase. And one of those papers that I think is really most interesting is this one, where Thornton Chase writes to John, "The instructive power of this word is so strong and clear that he who is touched by it soon finds that he knows more about spiritual matters than his neighbor, and he gets a sort of spiritual swelled head. It is like the youth who passes out from childhood into the period of adolescence. He feels the currents of life within him and thinks he knows more than parents, brothers, sisters, or anyone else. We recognize the source of this and smile at him, although for a while he is an intolerable nuisance. As it is physically, so it is spiritually." So we begin to see where John Bosch gained so many of his spiritual insights from Thornton Chase. We also know that Thornton Chase died before Abdu'l-Bahá arrived in New York. And you'll see in reading the book that I paralleled the travel of Abdu'l-Bahá to the border of California, and I coincided the travel with the account of the last days of Thornton Chase, so that we'll read that just as Abdu'l-Bahá was crossing into the state of California across the Nevada border, Thornton Chase passed away. And we know that that's what brought Abdu'l-Bahá to Southern California, where Abdu'l-Bahá visited the grave of Thornton Chase. But prior to Abdu'l-Bahá coming to California, John decided that he would travel to New York to see Abdu'l-Bahá himself. And he said, John Bosch writes, "When I heard that Abdu'l-Bahá intended to visit America and was on the ocean from Alexandria, Egypt, I felt a strong desire to meet him, not to meet him for curiosity or novelty, but for a longing to see him." And so John took the train from Oakland to New York, and arriving at the Hotel Ansonia, John Bosch writes, "I arrived at the hotel in New York on Wednesday, April 17th by 6 a.m. Without further formalities, I started for the 5th floor and found Dr. Getzinger at the door, and the door was open to Abdu'l-Bahā's apartments. In a few minutes, I was called into his parlor. I had in mind to enter cool and resigned as into a business office, and I was introduced as John D. Bosch of California. With a warm, wholesome handshake, Abdu'l-Bahá greeted me and said, 'I have been longing to see you.' He offered me a chair and to be seated close where he was seated, and I said that I am greatly pleased and fortunate to have the opportunity and privilege to meet him so early in New York, and that I traveled 3,000 miles to see him. To which Abdu'l-Bahá answered, 'I have traveled 8,000 miles to see you.' I had a pocket full of questions from the West, but never gave them to Abdu'l-Bahá, for he told me all that I wanted to know. I said to Abdu'l-Bahá, 'I regret very much that I have not the capacity as a teacher, and by nature rather reserved in talking, and that the work I have been doing in the cause was mostly in the line of universal peace, and by circulating books and pamphlets.' Abdu'l-Bahá looked directly at me, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, 'You are doing well. You are doing better than talking. It is not always the elaborate talking, the movement of the lips that would accomplish results. It is the heart that is powerful. With you, it is not words. Your heart speaks.' Later that day, there were 3 taxis awaiting Abdu'l-Bahá and his party. Abdu'l-Bahá stepped into the first taxi, and as I neared the taxi, Abdu'l-Bahá put his hand and pulled me right in. He seemed very tired and immediately put his arm around my waist, put his head on my left shoulder, and with a big sigh, fell asleep. The believers expected that the drive would afford Abdu'l-Bahá an opportunity to see the streets and public buildings of New York. But instead of looking at all the big buildings, to our surprise, Abdu'l-Bahá had a restful nap. I traveled with Abdu'l-Bahá to Washington, D.C., and attended most of the meetings there. Departing from Washington, D.C., again, I had the privilege to travel with Abdu'l-Bahá in the same railway car with him to Chicago. He traveled the Pullman car called Marvelous over the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. While on this trip, I took occasion to say to Abdu'l-Bahá that if he should have time to visit Geyserville, I would be highly honored, though I could not offer him a palace. He quickly responded, with you, I would sleep in the basement." It just happened that I had recently raised my house and added a comfortable basement. In Chicago on the 1st of May, the California believers had a special audience with Abdu'l-Bahá in his apartment. And at 11 o'clock, we all went to the temple grounds for the dedication. It was a frightfully cold day, very raw weather, and Abdu'l-Bahá unfortunately caught a terrible cold. It was part of the program for a representative of every nation to turn over a shovelful of earth. And so I was called upon to represent Switzerland. And as you look at this photograph, by the way, John Bosch is not pictured in this photograph. I thanked Abdu'l-Bahá for the privilege of traveling with him from New York to Washington and thence from Washington to Chicago. He replied, "I wanted you to come." And then he rose and took from the table a big cake, 12 or 14 inches in diameter, which he handed to me. Also some bananas, apples, and oranges until my arms were packed full to overflowing. And that was goodbye. One apple and the bananas my companion, Dr. DeEvelyn, and I enjoyed on the train when we crossed the highest altitude in the Rocky Mountains, thinking of partaking of spiritual food at the highest elevation. The cake was carefully preserved until we reached our destination, then shared with the believers in San Francisco, and thus the faraway friends, about 40 in all, partook of this bounty of spiritual fellowship. When Abdu'l-Bahá came to California, it was the busy harvest season in Geyserville, and I could not remain in San Francisco during his entire visit. I came to the city whenever I could for some of the public meetings. I attended the big feast at Mrs. Goodall's home in Oakland, but I did not have any further private talks with Abdu'l-Bahá, other than in Oakland a few days before he left for the East. As there were no interpreters present, there was nothing said, and Abdu'l-Bahá was very tired, lying on the bed, resting, and we merely had a silent greeting and parting. Well, it would not be the last time that John Bosch would see Abdu'l-Bahá, but the parting must have felt like a deep emptiness. Without the master and without Thornton Chase, John Bosch was alone, but not for long. Among the personal papers of John Bosch, there are several sheets of paper upon which he has made a list of the significant events in his life. Here is a portion of one of those brief chronologies wherein he measured the years of his life based on the year he first learned of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. In 1903, I read a book called Abbas Effendi. In 1909, in my 6th year, Convention. In 1910, in my 7th year, Mr. Chase. In 1912, in my 9th year, Abdu'l-Bahá in New York, Washington, and Chicago, San Francisco. And in 1913, in my 10th year, Louise came to my rescue. Louise was a Swiss from Zurich. They did not know each other in Switzerland. She had already immigrated to New York and was living there for some time. She was taught the faith by May Maxwell, one of her closest friends. And so they corresponded from California to New York. And Marcia Gale, in one of her interviews with John Bosch, she asked him, "How did you first meet Louise?" And John Bosch said, "I didn't meet her." And I often think about what he meant by that. I didn't meet her. And I think that it's because he felt that he always knew her. But when Louise was asked about how she met him, she said, "I remember that I first met him through correspondence. And in that correspondence, I knew that he was the man who could know the deepest recesses of my heart." John and Louise were married in January 19th, 1914, and Abdu'l-Bahá sent them a letter congratulating them on their marriage. And he wrote, you're looking at the envelope of the letter, but the tablet reads, "O ye two souls of pure spirit, praise be to God that you have spread the feast of union and prepared the banquet of rejoicing. It is blessed. I beg of God that this union be eternal and the means of everlasting happiness. Thus in all the divine worlds ye may live together. Upon ye be Baha el-Abha." And so John and Louise married right at the time of the dissemination of the tablets of the divine plan, which were published in the Star of the West. And in fact, Robert Stockman has posted on the Wilmette Institute a very clear and succinct page that explains how the tablets were mailed to different individuals in America. And I think that it would be good to visit that page so that we understand fully the import of the tablets of the divine plan. But Louise took it upon herself to decide where they would go, how they would respond to the tablets of the divine plan, and where they would go. And one night she had a dream where in her dream she kept hearing the word Lottie, Lottie. And she woke up and thought, what is this Lottie? And she looked it up and found that it was a book by a Frenchman, and the book was called The Marriage of Lottie. And another title for the book was Tahiti. And so, of course, she took it as a sign and told John that they had to pioneer to Tahiti. And so in March of 1920, they left from Oakland on the Moana and went to Tahiti, where they pioneered. While on the boat, John Bosch saw a man reading a book by the same author of The Marriage of Lottie, and he asked the man what the title of that book was, and when he saw the title said Towards Isfahan, John said, do not show my wife that book, as though it would inspire them to go to Isfahan, which of course we know is the place of the burial of the Prince of Martyrs and the King of Martyrs. And so their time in Tahiti was actually only 5 months, but they had great success there. This is a photograph of a large family who came into the faith. They are the Drolet family, and Alexander Drolet is seen standing next to Louise. He's holding the tree branch. And there are some wonderful stories about him in the Bosch book. And there were 2 others who also entered the faith at that time, and some extensive stories are told in the book about their lives. But their time there was short-lived because of the I would say, prejudice towards Germans from the Tahitians due to the war. And the Tahitian people could not get past the idea that they thought that John and Louise were German and not Swiss. And so Louise felt it best that they return. And upon their return to Geyserville, they received a letter from Abdu'l-Bahá where he said that he is in the utmost longing to see them. And so they wrote to Abdu'l-Bahá and asked if they could come on pilgrimage. And they received a 2-word cable back that said, Bosch is permitted. And so now we enter this part of the story that I think requires our greatest degree of reverence, because it is about the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. And I omitted in this slideshow many of the accounts that John Bosch gives about the preparation of Abdu'l-Bahā's body for burial. I just didn't think it was suitable really for this format, but I encourage anyone who's interested to read this chapter, as it contains John Bosch's account of the details of the burial of Abdu'l-Bahá. Those present at the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá were, of course, John and Louise Bosch, a German youth who John and Louise Bosch brought with them, named Joanna Hoff, and Dr. and Mrs. Krug from the United States, Ethel Rosenberg, and Curtis Kelsey, also from the United States. And we know that Curtis Kelsey was there because he had been called there to install the electrical lighting for the Shrine of the Bab. The others present were pilgrims, but Curtis Kelsey was there working, as he's shown here in Baji in 1921. It was Abdu'l-Bahā's wish before he died that because the Bab was not even afforded a candle in his imprisonment, that Abdu'l-Bahá was determined that before his death, he would make sure that the Shrine of the Bab was bathed in light. And of course, Curtis Kelsey is the one who installed the lighting. And one of the doors in the Shrine of the Bab is actually named for Curtis Kelsey. John Bosch had some wonderful meetings with Abdu'l-Bahá the week before Abdu'l-Bahā's passing, where Abdu'l-Bahá would feed him fruits in the garden. And it's really quite remarkable. But I wanted to now read to you John Bosch's account of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, and I'm excluding the details of the actual burial and preparation of his body. After midnight, we were awakened in the pilgrim house by a few loud knocks given in rapid succession, and we wondered what had happened. My watch pointed to 1:20 o'clock. My wife said, "Something must have happened to Abdu'l-Bahá. Let us hurry and find out what this unusual call is." In a few minutes, we were running to the house of Abdu'l-Bahá, where we found that it was only too true that our master had just passed away. We entered the room, finding all the family of Abdu'l-Bahá there, Abdu'l-Bahá resting in bed as though he were still alive. Approaching the bed, I could not resist to take his hand, not trusting he was dead. It was warm and lifelike. Then I touched his forehead and hoped that he still might utter a word, but it was only too true that our master had passed away. His spirit had departed. The greatest holy leaf then kindly reached her hand to me and motioned me to sit beside her, which I did. The room became filled with friends and people from the town, and the antechamber and the hall too became filled. It is indescribable to describe the sorrow and weeping uttered by the people in that hour. To me, it seemed that thousands of thoughts went through my mind in those moments. Sometimes there comes to all of us a feeling of a sigh for expression when only our silence really registers the depth of our emotion, and our moist eyes suggest what words could never reveal. So I cannot express the deep stirrings within me when all in deep silence I arose again and touched the hand and forehead of Abdu'l-Bahá still warm. I said, "Oh, Abdu'l-Bahá." And Rizwaniye said later how they loved it that in the deep silence someone called the name of the master. The hour for the funeral had been set for 9 o'clock the next morning, Tuesday. Sharply at 9, a call was given. The doors were opened, the casket was lifted from the floor by the appointed pallbearers who carried it out of the door. And of course, John Bosch was one of those pallbearers. And down the steps, through the gate, along the short street about the length of 2 of our city blocks, to the road which led up Mount Carmel. It seemed that never had there been such a funeral procession before. So great was the desire to help carry the casket up the mountain that some of the men were wrangling for the privilege of only touching it with their fingertips. For an hour and a half, that great mass of people slowly moved along the winding road up the steep incline of Mount Carmel. It was a perfect day, one of the most beautiful one could imagine. As I turned and looked back now and then, many were the thoughts that came to me as I watched all those people wending their way up the mountain. Ahead was the tomb of the Bab. Behind me were the blue Mediterranean and the Bay of Haifa, and 9 miles away was the old city of Akka, and in the distance, the Lebanon mountains. Never can I forget this scene. We know that Shoghi Effendi was in Oxford at the time, and in fact, he couldn't get passage to Haifa until nearly a month after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. And he was in such great shock upon arrival in Haifa and being read the will and testament that appointed him guardian of the Baha'i faith. Rahia Khanum writes in Priceless Pearl that he had absolutely no foreknowledge that he would be appointed guardian of the cause of God. In Adib Taherzadeh's book called The Child of the Covenant, he explains, although the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá was read out to Shoghi Effendi soon after his arrival in Haifa, it had to be formally presented to the members of the family and others in the Holy Land. On the 3rd of January, 1922, in the presence of 9 persons, mainly senior members of Abdu'l-Bahá's family, and in Shoghi Effendi's absence, the will and testament was read aloud, and its seal, signature, and handwriting were shown to those present. Later, the Greatest Holy Leaf sent cables to Persia and America, the two major communities at that time, informing them that according to the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, Shoghi Effendi had been appointed guardian of the cause of God. And then later on January 7th was the public reading of the will at which John Bosch was present. John and Louise Bosch stayed in Haifa at the request of Biha Khanum for 2 more months. And when it came time for John and Louise to prepare for their departure, Shoghi Effendi did something quite remarkable. He first took them to see the picture of Baha'u'llah, and then he took them into his room and handed them a portion of the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá and asked them to deliver it to the National Bahá'í Convention in Chicago to be held in April of that year. And it is really astounding to think of the significance when we know that Persia is the cradle of this New World Order, and that America is the cradle of the administrative order, and that it is an American believer, John Bosch, who carried a portion of that document that established America as the cradle of the administrative order. Shoghi Effendi said that it would take a century for us to understand the mysteries of the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. And it's wonderful to think about that in light of the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the reading of the Master's will. When John and Louise Bosch returned, of course, they became so beloved of the American Baha'i community because, as Munire Khanum said, she's the wife of Abdu'l-Bahá, she said to John and Louise that they were present at the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá on behalf of all American believers. And so in 1925, on the 70th birthday of John Bosch, they held a gathering at their home in Geyserville, California, and John and Louise are here. And it was at that gathering that they decided that they should try to have an anniversary of this gathering every summer and turn their school into a permanent Baha'i school, which introduced the establishment of the first Baha'i school committee for the Pacific Coast. And I titled this chapter The Indefatigable Trio because that committee was made up by George Latimer, who was 36 at the time, John Bosch, 71, and Leroy Iwas at age 30. And it's so wonderful that this faith of ours has no age restrictions, except that we cannot fast until we're 15, and that we cannot obtain permission for marriage until we were 15, and that we no longer need to fast after we are 70. But other than that, and elected to institutions when we are 21. Other than that, there are no age restrictions for service in the cause. And so at the age of 71, John Bosch embarked on really this great enterprise of establishing a permanent Baha'i school. Those of you who are listening might, maybe there's someone who would be inspired to write a biography about George Latimer. We need writers in the faith, and we need Baha'is in the present to write biographies for the future. And I think George Latimer's life really is worthy of someone to do some research on it. We know that there is a wonderful biography of Leroy Iwas written by his daughter. And in fact, I have Leroy Iwas' grandson to thank. Hillary Chapman gave me these pictures of his grandfather to include in the Bosch book. In the establishment of the Baha'i school, the first goal of that Baha'i school was that people become great teachers of the cause, but one of the unexpected outcomes of those summer sessions at Geyserville was a unity that Leroy Iwas described as a unity that was not alone of the mind, but of the depths of the heart. And that unity really began at the National Bahá'í Convention in San Francisco. It was the first time that the convention had been held on the West Coast. And I know that many Baha'is are actually familiar with something that took place at this convention. It was at that convention that Louis Gregory gave his address, wherein he described the efforts of the Baha'is to establish race unity were the efforts that could be likened to the lever of Archimedes, where we have the power of the oneness of mankind to move the world. And so it is that address that he gave at that convention, and it shaped the way that John Bosch thought about what would be necessary as the subject of study at the Baha'i School. At the next convention in 1927, the discussions about race unity were furthered by Sadie Oglesby, who was the first African-American woman to go on pilgrimage. And she went on pilgrimage in March of 1927 and then spoke at the convention in Montreal in 1927. And the subject of her words continue to inspire us today. In fact, her address was so moving to the delegates that they unanimously voted to have a transcript of her address disseminated to all spiritual assemblies in the United States and Canada. And here is a portion of her address. The world is looking to see what the Baha'is of America are going to do about race unity. In this great hour of turmoil, when everybody and every group of people are talking about universal brotherhood and justice, we Baha'is must be that center that is not living in the realm of thinking about it, but are the ones who actually have it in practice. Further about the establishment of unity at the Baha'i School is, I think, worth mentioning that the first Persians to come to America their trip was organized by the Guardian, and some of those Persians who came here, many of us in California especially are familiar with, and they arrived in February of 1944, and by July they were assigned to spend their summer in Geyserville with John Bosch. And pictured here, of course, is Shidan Fatihzam, who later pioneered to Southern Africa. In fact, this picture was given to me by his wife, Florence Fatihzam, and she's still alive and living in South Africa. And Amin Banani, of course, John Bosch, and Firuz Kazemzadeh. Firuz Kazemzadeh was interviewed that summer by the Geyserville Gazette, and Firuz Kazemzadeh explained that what the Baha'i summer schools were for, and that they were for the study of the writings so that we could know them well enough to explain the teachings to others in its purest form. And he said that the Baha'i summer schools in Persia, in fact, were modeled after the Geyserville summer school model. The attendance at the summer schools just grew and grew each year. And particularly like this photo, because you see John Bosch's hat there and John Bosch on the left. And it grew so to have so many people in attendance that it became necessary to think about how to expand the school facilities, because the guests camped out or they slept on the floor in various rooms of John and Louise Bosch's home. And so such expansion would require a fairy godmother of sorts. And of course, Millie Collins would be that fairy godmother. Amelia Collins was described as, by Shoghi Effendi, as the great benefactress of the cause. And of course, we know that the Collins Gate, which opens the entryway to the shrine of Baha'u'llah in Baji, is named for her by the Guardian. But she contributed greatly to the buildings of the cause of Baha'u'llah. The Western Pilgrim House, she contributed to the building of the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab, the Baha'i International Archives, the embellishments around the Shrine of Baha'u'llah in Baji. She purchased the entire property on which the future temple site will be built on Mount Carmel. She contributed to the house of worship for Europe, Australia, and Africa. And of course, she contributed to all of the needs of the building projects to expand Bosch, John and Louise Bosch's property for a summer school. When Millie Collins referred to Geyserville as a paradise, heaven, and home, she was describing how she felt about John and Louise. To be near them was to be in paradise. To know them was to be in heaven. To be loved by them was to be home. Once, when Millie had been traveling from Geyserville to a National Teaching Committee meeting, one of the friends asked her where she had arrived from, and Millie replied, "From heaven." She had a love for John and Louise she described as a love that cannot be measured. In another letter to them, she wrote, "I can hardly wait to be in that home of yours, John and Louise, which is the nearest to me as Haifa. And how tenderly I think of your dear and your blessed care of us all. Future ages will speak of it in befitting language." Of course, we also know that the Geyserville property had a redwood grove. And I remember even myself as a child, we had to climb a little hill up to the grove with our flashlights at night, and we would all have our evening prayers at night with flashlights, and it was really quite wonderful. And so when the property of John and Louise Bosch in Geyserville was later condemned by the state of California because the state of California wished to expand the Redwood Highway, which would include part of the property of John and Louise Bosch, the National Spiritual Assembly had to seek another replacement property. And that's how we found the property in Santa Cruz. And the property was discovered really by my own father-in-law, John Kenton Allen, who drove around the Santa Cruz Mountains and found the current property of the Bosch Bahá'í School. And he and his son, Andrew, who was a teenager at the time, could barely believe that this property was exactly what the National Spiritual Assembly was looking for, and it had a redwood grove. And so this photograph is a photograph of the redwood grove at the current Bosch Bahá'í School in Santa Cruz. And you can see that it grows this is what's called a fairy ring, and it's a ring of trees that grows in a circle around a center in which an original tree grew. And then it fell probably a few thousand years ago. And when it fell, it sprouted new trees around it. When you stand inside this grove, it is really marvelous. And one gets a feeling that one is in a cathedral or in the house of worship in Wilmette. I like to think that these trees, which are really just about 100 years old, these trees that we're looking at, that they will still be living when the next manifestation of God is proclaimed. The last chapter of the book is about saints. And in a conversation with Hooper Dunbar, he said to me that in all of the writings of the Baha'i faith, there are only 3 people outside of the Holy Family who are called saints by the Guardian. And he said it is William Sutherland Maxwell, who is pictured here with Mae Maxwell, and Roy Wilhelm, and John Bosch. And so in that chapter, you'll find that I cover a little bit about each of their lives, of what it is that gives them their saintly character. But I'd like to share with you what Abdu'l-Bahá says about a saint and what it means to be a saint. In one of his talks given in Paris in 1911, Abdu'l-Bahá described the qualities of a saint. Saints are men who have freed themselves from the world of matter and who have overcome sin. They live in the world but are not of it, their thoughts being continually in the world of the spirit. Their lives are spent in holiness, and their deeds show forth love, justice, and godliness. John died on July 22nd, 1946, And the Guardian's cable to America read, profoundly grieved passing dearly beloved, great-hearted, high-minded, distinguished servant Baha'u'llah, John Bosch. His saintly life, pioneer services, historic contribution of institution of summer school entitle him to rank among outstanding figures of the closing years heroic and opening years of the formative age of the Baha'i dispensation. Concourse on high extol his exalted services. Assure his wife and valiant companion of my deep sympathy. Advise hold special gathering in temple as tribute to his imperishable memory. And so that concludes at least the slideshow.
It was so beautiful, Angelina. It was just so beautiful. I was very impressed, really. I loved it. And I had not seen that, or probably read a long time ago, that letter of Thornton Chase's about spiritually immature. I love that. I hadn't seen that probably ever.
Right, about how we may become spiritual nuisances.
Yeah. Yeah, that was quite amusing and all too true, I suppose. All too true. Mike says, hi, Angie, thanks for doing this. Mike and Nancy love.
Oh, Lavish. Mike and Nancy Lavish. They live in Southern California and such wonderful, devoted believers. They'll anything that's needed, they arise to do it.
So they offered that thanks to you. I'm sort of wondering what to ask actually in terms of questions, but you might want to say a little bit. I mean, Geyserville's not that far from San Francisco, so you might want to say a little something about how, was it easy for him to get down there? How close was he associated with the Baha'i community there in Oakland and San Francisco? It's what, like an hour or so on the train, something like that?
He would take the train from San Francisco to Cloverdale, which probably would take about an hour, and then from Cloverdale to Healdsburg, which is near Geyserville. And so, but he traveled back and forth frequently. He was in the city a lot. Mm-hmm. And as you know from the letters back and forth between Thornton Chase and John Bosch.
Yeah, I guess John Bosch would go into town if Thornton Chase was there, because Thornton Chase often had to go to San Francisco for work because he ran insurance offices. Mm-hmm. So I love the story of they would go to hang out at one person's hotel, and then at midnight, John would say, Thornton, let me walk you back to your hotel. And they'd spend 2 more hours there. And then Thornton would say, John, let me walk you back to your hotel. And they would do that. That's the story that Marcia Gale has in one of her books. Mm-hmm. One person asked, where was he buried?
He is buried at Olive Hill Cemetery in Geyserville. Louise wanted them to be buried right there on their own property, which really is, it's wonderful that didn't work out because we sold that property to the state of California.
Yeah.
And in fact, I know that there is such a case where Roy Wilhelm is buried, I believe, is on property that we don't own.
Huh.
I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But I know that it's a blessing that Louise's wish was not realized. And they are buried at Olive Hill Cemetery, where anyone can go and visit their grave. So it's I was thinking, just for some reason, just thinking of Shidam Fatihazam, because he spent his summers there, and he actually assisted in the burial of John Bosch.
One person, Merat, asks, did he get back to Switzerland or teach the faith there?
When they traveled, yes, and that's discussed in the book, in the chapter about the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. On their way to Haifa, they did a short teaching trip to several countries, which included Switzerland. And then on their way back, continued their teaching trip to countries in Europe. In fact, there's a whole section there on a lengthy stay they had in Germany. And that's described and explained. So yes, they did return to Switzerland in 1921. Other than that, they had not returned. That was their only return to Switzerland. In fact, both of them considered America their home.
Mm-hmm. One person mentions that Mark Tobey did a portrait of John Bosch.
Yes, you can Google it. Just Google Mark Tobey, John Bosch, and it's a very interesting photograph. The photograph is, sketching, and it's framed at and hung at the Martha Root Hall at Bosch Bahá'í School. And there's a funny cable that Mark Tobey sent after he spent a summer at Geyserville. He sent John and Louise a cable that read, I miss the tree, I miss the table, I miss you all, this is no fable. And we know also that Mark Tobey's paintings are so valuable now. And Joyce Dahl, who lived in Monterey in Carmel. She had a very large collection of his paintings. I know my own sister, Dawn Shelley, has a lovely painting of Mark Tobey's. And Joyce Dahl contributed all of that collection to the Stanford Museum.
Oh, that would be quite remarkable then. Neda says, thank you for putting together this heartwarming and delightful presentation.
Oh, that sounds like Neda Tawfiq.
Tawfiq, yeah.
It has to be.
Yeah.
Neda.
Dawn Shelley says, wonderful overview of your terrific book, Angie. Can you share a bit more about the types of that were offered at Geyserville?
About the types of what?
Programs.
Yes. Dawn Shelley is my sister, and she's one whose opinion I deeply value. And so I'm going to give my best answer to this question. In the book, there is, I was so happy that my editor, who is Christopher Martin, who's just absolutely wonderful. By the way, in fact, when we first started editing the book together, he said to me, it'll be so wonderful to serve together. And I thought, well, what a wonderful way to think about writing a book for the faith. Because again, if you're writing for the faith, you're not writing for any profit. You are offering it as a service to the cause. And it's a wonderful path of service, and we need many more. But to the programs, the first program of the school focused on really the fundamental verities of the faith. It focused on race unity. In fact, John and Louise invited Louis Gregory to speak and be the teacher at that summer session in 1927. And Louis Gregory wrote back saying, I'm already committed to Greenacre. And so although John and Louise were disappointed, they did not change the program. They kept the program as though it was Louis Gregory teaching it. And they found other people to teach the same things they thought Louis Gregory should do. And so I cannot emphasize it enough. I think it's so important and quite impressive that John and Louise made race unity the pivotal principle of the summer school, as it is the pivotal principle of the Baha'i cause.
I want to agree with you about George Latimer and your comment about how there's a need for a biography. He, of course, his family is one of the first Baha'i families in Oregon. They go way back in Oregon to the 1900s, it seems to me. His mother was an active Baha'i. He was served on the National Spiritual Assembly later on. In fact, it seems to me I've seen a picture of the National Spiritual Assembly, perhaps it was in the 40s or so, and just about every member of the National Spiritual Assembly later was a hand of the cause, except for George. Yes. So, I mean, he was right there in this company of really, really believers, and was himself quite a remarkable believer and a businessman, I believe.
Yes, some things about him is that he was a contemporary of the Guardian. He knew the Guardian. He traveled to the Holy Land. in 1919, before Shoghi Effendi was appointed guardian. I would venture to say they were buddies, even to think of it that way. I don't know if that's very respectful to say it that way, but they, Abdu'l-Bahá's tablets about him, about what a promising youth he was. In 1944, when we celebrated the centenary of the cause of Baha'u'llah, George Latimer was the chairman of the National Spiritual Assembly and gave the centenary address at that commemoration. There's so much that can be researched about him, and I hope someone does. I may, but I think it's important to remember. It's such a wonderful story that I had gone into the archives, and there was Arthur Dahl, and I was researching a book for the story of Keith Ransom Kaler, which I'm still in the process of doing. But
you mean Roger Dahl?
I'm sorry, Roger. Yes, not Arthur. That's right.
Roger's the
Arthur earlier today, and I was thinking of him. Roger. And so Roger is one of the archivists at the archives in the basement of the House of Worship. And so before I started the Bosch book, I was working on the Keith Ransom Kaler biography. And so I said to him, is there anyone else working on a biography on Keith Ransom Kaler? Because if there is, then I won't do it. And he looked at me and he said, many books can be written on Keith Ransom Kaler. And I said, oh, I mean, what a wonderful thought is that we all can write about our history, and these books don't have to be singular. Anyway, for various reasons, I have postponed that work on Keith Ransom Kaler and worked on the John Bosch book. And I still, there was a friend who said to me, I'm thinking of writing a book on John Bosch, and but it'll be about this part of his life. And I said, how wonderful that so many books can be written on these great heroes of the cause.
Definitely. Yeah, Neda says, any way to receive the recording? And the answer, of course, Neda, is we will put the recording up on the Wilmette Institute's YouTube channel within hours of this meeting. So, and of course, we'll send the link out in our News at a Glance that goes out weekly. Bryn Deemer says that he sent a photograph of Louise and John Bosch's headstone to the Wilmette Institute email address for our information. So we might be able to share that with people. Someone raises their hand, but I don't know how to do about raising your hand. So you're better off putting a comment in the chat box. Paul Mantle says, I was struck by the rigorous, lengthy sessions in the early days of Geyserville, a model for our time. Perhaps people had longer attention spans than we have now.
The sessions were 2 weeks long. My father and I, in the late 80s, at the request of the National Spiritual Assembly, we started a youth academy at Bosch Bahá'í School, and it was a 2-week-long session where we limited the attendance to about 24 high school and college-age youth, and we took them through the fundamental verities of the faith, much like the Geyserville days. And it included as well a portion of the day was spent learning about forestry, husbandry, because Bosch Bahá'í School has 68 acres of redwood forest. And the students would come for 2 weeks. I think that those types of sessions will inevitably return. We're devoting our time right now to strengthening the work at the neighborhood level. And we know that at the conclusion of this plan, which has been a 25-year plan, that we will conclude in a year, that the House of Justice will have a 1-year plan where we will be given information about preparations for even greater work ahead. And certainly that has got to mean that we will return to a study of the central texts of our cause and deepen these new adherence to the cause on the fundamental verities of the faith.
Yeah. Robin says, can you share with us why you were personally inspired to write about John Bosch?
I have to credit Brent Poirier with that. I was a teenager at Bosch, and one summer in particular, I remember it was 1978 because it was the time of the Watsonville Teaching Project, and Brent was the librarian. In fact, maybe I should send to the Wilmette Institute a photograph of him, and next to him are my twin sister and I, and it was taken in around 1978. It's a wonderful photo.
Love to say that. Yeah.
And Brent was the librarian, and my twin sister Margie and I were always in the library looking at all of the books that are there, and he began to talk to us about the story of John Bosch. And particularly, what struck me was he explained the part about how John Bosch fell asleep on, I keep saying that Abdu'l-Bahá fell asleep on John Bosch's, it would be his left shoulder, and that later John Bosch would bear Abdu'l-Bahá on his right shoulder when he was a pallbearer for his coffin. And the idea of that so struck me that I needed to know more about John Bosch. And so I think I spent about 10 years writing this book, but it was really more just out of enjoyment. It was like a visit with John Bosch every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Then let's see. Eugene says, thank you for discovering Sadie Oglesby's convention notes in the National Archives while researching John Bosch. Those have been going around now, it seems to me.
That's Jean Dixon. Hi, Jean.
Yes, Jean Dixon.
Jean and Renee Dixon, they're Baha'is in Southern California. And yes, when I came across, when I was preparing chapter 9 of the Bosch book, which is the book really that focuses on the establishment of race unity as a subject of the Baha'i school, I happened upon this document, transcript of Sadie Oglesby's talk. And so this was about 3 years ago when I happened upon that. And I sent it to some of my close Baha'i friends. I sent it to Carol Grady Mansour and Barbara Talley and Sue St. Clair. And they, are really the ones who started the first Pupil of the Eye conference that was held in Nashville over the weekend of the Day of the Covenant. And it was a wonderful gathering for people of color to find and explore and recognize their unique station in the Baha'i community. And because they alone are singled out in the Baha'i community as having a vision that can guide the rest of us. And so this talk by Sadie Oglesby became pivotal because it shows that even this would have been 1927. Sadie Oglesby shared her time with Shoghi Effendi, and if we think about the ideas that informed Shoghi Effendi's later letter called "The Advent of Divine Justice," that was written in December of 1938, we can see the things that informed his understanding of the condition of race in America. And certainly it would have been informed by persons like Sadie Oglesby, who the Guardian interviewed and asked her questions and learned from her. And so she is a quite remarkable Baha'i for us to all learn from.
Daniel Schaubacher says, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your presentation and for preserving John Bosch's memory in your book. And he is a Swiss-Belgian Baha'i.
Oh, wonderful. I hope in some way we can be in contact. Maybe through Robert Stockman, we can exchange emails. I would love to be in contact with more Swiss Baha'is about what more can be done to bring John Bosch back to Switzerland.
Ah, good. Well, I'll grab his email address here and paste it somewhere where I can find it later, because he did include it. Great presentation, Angie. Thank you so much, Ray and Barbara Rudolph.
Oh, Ray and Barbara Rudolph. Ray and Barbara Rudolph, I just have to mention this. They were the ones at the passing of Mr. Furitan. They were present in the room, and Mr. Furitan collapsed to the floor. And it's protocol for paramedics to try to revive him. And Ray, being a doctor, and Barbara, being a nurse, put their bodies over the body of Mr. Furitan, and Ray pronounced Mr. Furitan deceased. And that was so that the paramedics would not impose upon Mr. Furitan's body.
Interesting.
And also I saw Anne Sadeghipour there. Anne Sadeghipour is Molly King's daughter.
Oh, yes. Yes, and Molly is a very fond memory for me as well. First time I spoke at Bosch, Molly was the one who briefed me, invited me to come. And when I was leaving Bosch in 1985 to go back to San Jose Airport, she was driving me, or she was in the car with me. She said, "There's this new message on peace from the World Center, and I thought maybe I would share it with you. It's not published yet." So she shared the peace statement with me in unpublished form. So that I have very fond memories of Molly.
Yeah,
and I think I told some of this to Anne actually at one point.
I think it's wonderful for us to know that, Molly King had 5 children. Mim is one of my own contemporaries, and of course Anne, and there's Walter. And one of Molly King's other daughters is the one who actually wrote the song "God Is One."
Oh,
it's written by one of Molly King's daughters.
Oh, that's marvelous. Let's see, and we have Arthur Dahl says, "I have sent Toby's portrait of John Bosch and a photo of Louise Bosch in Tahiti to the Wilmette Institute. Joyce Dahl attended the first summer school in Geyserville. I grew up there every summer." So that's, of course, Arthur Lyon Dahl, who is watching, I guess, from Switzerland at this very moment.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Arthur, for all of your important work and representing the cause at such high levels. It's a great service on behalf of all of us.
And he'll be one of the speakers next week, of course, in the web talk we have with him and Augusto and Maya Groff.
My father served as auxiliary board member with Joyce Dahl.
Yeah, with his mother.
Yeah.
That's true. Eugene says, "I'm in tears right now. Thank you so much." Eugene Dixon and Sadekpour. Thank you, Angie, still smiling.
Yeah.
This is becoming sort of a little bit of a family gathering almost.
That's what John Bosch does to us. He
yes,
creates a family.
Elham Moslahi says, "So beautifully narrated and explained, so soul-stirring. Many thanks." And as Margaret King was the oldest.
Yes.
Of the kids, I guess.
Yes.
I think we've run out of questions here. So, and comments. This really was a marvelous presentation. You really did a great job of animating it too, and you have a real art. There was a real art to your PowerPoint, and I have to thank you.
Well, I hope you'll find there's a real art to the book.
Yeah, I'm going to have to now read it very carefully because I'm way behind in catching up on Baha'i books.
The book is available through the United States Publishing Trust. It's also available on Amazon.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And I think I might actually have a copy of it already, but I'll be sure to put it on my list. Unfortunately, right now, with Wilmette Institute being extremely busy, I haven't had time to read anything for about 2 years. Kimberly Gila, thank you for your wonderful presentation of John Bosch. I am a Bay Area native.
Oh, wonderful.
And we certainly have learned a lot today about John Bosch, Geyserville, Bosch Baha'i School, Abdu'l-Bahá's visit to California, the early believers that knew him and he knew at the time, and really even up to contemporary times with the Persian boys arriving in the 1940s They were called the Persian Boys. I remember the
Right.
National Convention, and I think
Mhm.
it was 94. It was the 50th anniversary. A large number of them were there at the National Convention, and that was quite a
Yeah.
special gathering to see. And many of them, of course, now passed away, and we will miss them really very much. Firuz was a very important mentor for me. Well, I think we're pretty much at an end to our presentation today. So again, I want to thank you very, very much out of the
You.
absolute depths of my heart for this beautiful
Oh, thank you.
presentation.
Thank you
And,
very much.
and we're looking forward to other presentations coming up. As I said, next week we'll have Arthur Augusto Lopez Claros and Maya Graf talking about their book on the need for world government in the 21st century.
Mhm.
So again, Angie, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank
And
you, Robert.
thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we hope you have a good, safe week. Please wash your hands and stay at home and take care of yourselves so that we can avoid spreading this terrible coronavirus any further. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.